The Missing Witches Project is entirely listener supported, and listener, we want you to join us. Do you want to be part of a community that helps make public research into marginalized ideas? Do you want to join in interviews with all these magical people and meet other anti-racist, trans-inclusive, neuroqueer, feminist practitioners of different kinds from all over the world in our monthly circles? Or are you maybe just down to send a little money magic towards these stories and ideas and the causes we support? Anyway, either way, check out missingwitches.com to learn more about us. And please know, we've been missing you. And one last thing before we start. The stories we tell require a general content warning. It's just a fact of this terrain of interrogating what is missing. We promise to hold those moments with care.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
Well, first of all, someone tried to burn down our building or something yesterday.
Shit.
I don't know, put a microwave on fire in the hallway.
Ugh.
When I was outside, there was we have ravens that live around here in Toronto, which is very rare, but there was 8 of them in the sky, just cawing for 10 minutes. And I was like, okay, something's going on. Some sort of planet is moving backwards or something. But
You're getting responses about your work.
but yeah, it's been one of those weeks.
Okay. Welcome to the Missing Witches podcast, friends, coven mates, listeners far and wide, whatever the weather is, wherever you are. It's so nice to imagine you here coming in on the waves of the wind and the sound and joining us to talk about I want to talk about fiction, and I want to talk about real witches and research and channeling these stories and embodying them. And I want to talk about the ravens that have been visiting the author of Minique, Anna Maxymiw, who's here with us today. I'm so excited to talk about this book. I'm in Minique land. This book takes place in a historical Montreal in the woods. And so I felt so connected to her. Also, her way of thinking about witchcraft, also her way of really desiring men and desiring power and then being totally fucked by them, and also being so powerful and channeling her own power. And the way you write about fear, her constant awareness of fear around men. There are so many things about this that felt so fucking familiar and accurate. And I loved it. And so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. What a fabulous intro.
I'm channeling the ravens myself. It's such a pleasure, especially in this season, to get to read fiction, to just let fiction hold you for a little bit. And I guess I say in this period, in this period of the fucking apocalypse, in this period of the world, to just be held by fiction is really a gift. What was it like for you spending time with this story, writing a big piece of fiction?
It's so interesting because my first book was nonfiction, which I found easier. I mean, I think there's more of a potential for people getting upset about nonfiction because you're writing about real people. But the book Dirty Work was just a delight. And I don't want to say easy, but I really enjoyed writing it. But when you're writing a big piece of fiction, the onus is kind of all on you. And if the story sucks, it's your fault. It's, you made it up. So I started this book October 2017, which was the advent of Me Too, which felt interesting. And then I really wrote the bulk of it when I was at a writing residency on a remote Norwegian island in the Arctic in winter. And then I finished it up when the pandemic hit. We were doing major edits. And that felt weird because I was like, oh, I'm writing about a woman in isolation. I mean, no real spoilers, but there is, sickness that rips through Montreal. I was like, oh, this is kind of dovetailing. This is hitting a little too close to home. But it worked. It worked because the pandemic, at least in those early months, was kind of like an enforced writing residency, right? No one was doing anything. So
yeah, I mean, I definitely could tell that you had pandemic experience in reading about the fever. It was this is not how people wrote about this before.
No. And I don't want to, first of all, I hate the idea of a pandemic book no offense to any writers who are writing about, the pandemic, but I've read a few recently and it doesn't feel good because we're still in it. So I will
Mm.
say this is not a pandemic book. This is the book is not solely about a sickness, but that was a reality of life in New France at the time. So it happens.
Yeah, it's like a season that passes through the book. It's definitely not what the book's about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you go looking for Minique? Like, do you feel like you went looking for a historical story that would tell a story that you knew you wanted to tell? Or how did that process happen of kind of finding the story?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did not go looking for her. And I don't, as of late, I've been reading more historical fiction, or I should say fiction that's set in a historical time, because I think historical fiction is actually something different than what I'm writing. But the nuances, I mean, the publishing world, I feel like the boundaries are kind of dissolving. So perhaps it is historical fiction. I was listening to a podcast called Lore, which is by Aaron Mankey, and I'm really showing my hand here with all the cryptid stuff. And there was an episode on the Nain Rouge, which is, for people who haven't read the book, it's a little red imp that kind of popped up in New France. And Detroit actually has a parade to the Nain Rouge every year. And they had sightings like into the 80s, 1980s. And the podcast talked about this witch telling Cadillac's fortune. And Cadillac is the founder of Detroit. And it was kind of like a bolt from the blue. I thought, wow, what would happen if I made these people younger and a little bit more sexualized, and that's kind of how it started, and it just went from there.
And can you talk about how much research you did into Minique in New France? Like, what's the relationship between the research and the creativity when you're writing like this?
I do a ton of research, and my publisher was like, don't even worry about doing research, like just write the book. I think you just write it. And I was like, I can't, I have to do the research. So I read a lot. Something that's important to consider is that the only stories we're really getting out of New France at the time, especially Montreal, which was a backwater, are those of white men. That's really difficult to get, the real story. So I took creative liberties, and my author's note says that some people hate that, but been made very clear to me that it's not, I guess, pure historical fiction. But there's some things in the book that despite all the research I did, I'm not going to be using racial slurs to refer to Indigenous people. I tried my best to situate the story in Montreal in 1670. Like one of my exercises, which was really difficult, my editor made me mark up a map of Montreal at about that time, a little bit later, of where I thought everything was that I was writing about. So if I've done my job with research in that regard, then me saying the word indigenous instead of something utterly horrible hopefully won't yank you out of the story. But that was kind of a long way of saying, yes, I did a ton of research. I was emailing, I remember like emailing a coin collector asking like, what kind of money did they use in New France? And he was like, everything. Like it was just kind of harem scarum. So I really enjoy it. I really enjoy researching. I want to make it as authentic as possible within, the framework of not contributing another piece of sexist, probably ableist, racist literature to the CanLit pantheon.
Yeah, I kind of loved that because it felt really like to what I studied in school, really accurate to the time, lots of really like great detail that made me feel really immersed in it. And then moments where I was like, "Fuck yeah."
I know, I love that. And what's interesting is that people like my proofreader, my copy editor, they all picked up on that. Like, why are you using these terms? And I I've also seen that in reviews. I don't wanna frame it as like a complaint, but people have said, "Well, the language feels really modern at times." And I think, "Yes, good. That's what I
Yeah.
wanted to do." Right? That's what I wanted to do. And I don't really like reading history books where they're like, "The lady doth, doest." It's not really my jam. So I basically just wrote the book I think I'd wanna read.
Yeah, I loved reading it in that way, and I loved the moments where I'm not always drawn to historical fiction for exactly that reason, like, I don't need to know how much of a fucking nightmare it was for everybody all the
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
except for those like 4 dudes who were the worst, like I know enough about that. I don't need to
Yeah.
read that book over and over and over again. So I
Yeah.
love those moments when like and it comes out in the mouths of like bad guys. It comes out in the mouths of people too, where you hear the connection to our contemporary reality. Like I think it's Father Etienne when the priest says something like, "Women are not allowed to have body autonomy. They're not
Yeah.
allowed to own their own
Yeah.
bodies."
Bingo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. He was he's real, as from what I can tell. And like, well, all of these people are real. Like the story of Anne Lamarck dealing with the priest is allegedly real. I twisted some of the facts there, but again, I don't want to give away spoilers, but she has a major victory in the book, and that's real, allegedly. So it was really kind of easy to take these super interesting characters and kind of put a modern spin on them. And again, some people will like that, some people won't like that, but it made me feel good about writing it that way.
Yeah. Oh, I'm delighted to learn that Anne is real.
She is. She is real. And the words she said to the priest, I hate the way I'm hedging this. Your listeners can be like, what is she talking about? But they're allegedly real as well. So I've had people be like, you need to write a book about Anne. Okay,
Yeah.
well, maybe at some point in the future I'll return to Montreal, 1700s, but not at the moment.
No. I mean, yeah, I was wondering when I was doing this podcast if I was gonna just let myself go spoiler crazy because I
I
get
know it's so hard.
to
And everyone who's reading it is sending texts like, I did not see that coming. I'm like, yeah, well, you're only 2/3 of the way through the book, so get ready.
Mhm.
I know it's hard to talk about it without spoiling too much.
Well, maybe what we'll do is we'll keep this episode very much like if you're listening and you haven't read this book, we'll tell you all the things we love about it and get you excited to think about Anna's writing process and how fucking fun this book is. And then maybe we'll do like 15 minutes at the end that we'll just put on the Patreon because
Oh, yeah.
I know the 2 people here read the book and I know a lot of the people in the coven read the book. So if you wanna talk about the sex scene or any of the scenes.
Yes.
We'll keep
Yes.
we'll keep that for the Pates.
I would love to. I haven't gotten able to talk about that in any interviews
Oh,
yet.
okay, we'll
So
do it. Let's do
yeah.
that. That'll be
Yep.
awesome. Yeah, so I'm so thrilled to know that lineage, that witch lineage, I mean, I know it's real from the research that I do, but to hear that you found it here in Montreal is not something that I knew at all. Can you tell us more
Right.
about the, like, witches, witch hunts
I
stories that you
can.
found?
Yeah, so interesting thinking back to starting this book because it's hard to remember the thought process. It's kind of a fugue state. And I don't remember why I picked Montreal. I can't remember if Minique was actually based out of it or if I just picked it because it was closer to the Straits of Mackinac and Detroit. But, Minique only pops up in this book that was written in the 1800s. Maybe the banquet was happening in Montreal. Maybe that's why I picked it. The Legends of Detroit. And so we don't know if she was actually real. But I thought, well, if they wrote about her, she was probably real in some regard. And it was really interesting. It's actually really kind of difficult to find a history of witchcraft in New France. There is one book about like New France kind of witchcraft traditions. And it has one copy that's in the library in Ottawa, like the big library there. And the pandemic happened. So I was like, well, I guess I'm not going there. And luckily someone, and it's the kind of book you can't check out. Like you have to go sit in the reference room and look at it. And luckily someone, God bless the internet, someone fitted it on Tumblr, like all the stuff that they had like taken pictures of in that book. Love that ingenuity. So, it's interesting. It sounds like New France witchcraft was very much a mix of religion and sort of pagan rituals in the same way that like Slavic witchcraft is. It's one of those kind of unique blends. But what I could find of people who were sentenced and killed specifically for witchcraft, like specifically for sorcery. The main record I could find was of a man who had been shot for like he seduced a young woman in her dreams. Okay, he was probably a pervert. So, probably good. It was really fascinating to me that at this time in New France, there wasn't a big history of hunting down women and killing them for witchcraft. But at the same time, in the colonies in the States and overseas in Europe, that was really prevalent. So I thought, well, that's kind of fascinating. I think the settlers were probably just trying to survive in this, new world that they had landed in.
They really didn't have the emotional energy to be witch hunting, and
Mhm.
also, like, they really needed any bit of healing, any bit of knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. The sage femmes, it was, it's really interesting actually researching too, because they were kind of reticent to with the Catholic priests. Like people didn't like Father Etienne, who was real, and they were fed up with him. And in one of the scenes, they very much sided with Anne when the scene happened in real life. They very much sided with her. So people think New France was very super patriarchal, super religious, and it was eventually. But I think in kind of the beginnings of it, it was more like, okay, we're just trying to stay alive by any means
Mhm.
possible.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. I think it's Maryse Condé in I, Tituba. She said that it was a channeled work. She was like, "Yeah, I spent, a decade or whatever it was researching Tituba, but as you say, like 99% of who that person was exceeds the archives."
Mhm.
And I really admire and love that she just kind of claims that fiction writing, I think in general, and for her in particular, in telling the story that's outside the archive, was an act of channeling. What
Mhm.
do you feel like there's a part of that process that is like hearing voices?
Yes, and not so much with this book, maybe because I've matured a little bit, but like the first book I ever wrote was for my thesis at UBC, and that was very much kind of like hearing voices. I think with Minique, it's interesting. People will read her and say, "Oh, I really hear you in her." And think, I don't see myself in her at all. And that made it perhaps a bit difficult to write, but also a really fabulous challenge. But then maybe I'm wrong because people who know me are like, "Oh, no, I totally see you in her." Interestingly enough, it was actually probably more of an active channeling to write Cadillac because he
Mm.
is the id as opposed to I wouldn't call Monique an ego or a super ego, but he is very much the id. And I think he is an example of what would happen if you just really gave in to your basest desires. And in a way, I think writing him was probably more of the act of channeling. And he, I think, is the most fascinating character to me in the book.
Talk more about that. Is that like, do you think about shadow work when you think about Cadillac? Is that part of it?
Cadillac. Yeah, I think so. It's kind of like if we're talking about shadow work, I'm going to quote Dexter, the show Dexter, when he talks about the dark passenger, the dark passenger who's with you at all times. And I really did a lot of reading on I have my witchcraft bookshelf, which is just one shelf that's crammed full of books I've collected. And, I did a lot of reading on like the horned one and the left-handed path and the poison path while writing about Cadillac. And it was super satisfying to kind of explore that dark side. And I thought a lot about the devil while writing him as well. I mean, Catholic school kid, grew up in a Catholic school for 10 years, and you always wonder, like, what about that other guy? And to me, Cadillac is sort of personification of the devil. The thing that the Catholic priests are warning so much about is that right actually is there, right within your ranks. And you've welcomed him in because he's so tricksy. So it was quite a release, I guess, to channel him and to write about him.
Hmm. So he's not the personification of one of my worst ex-boyfriends then? That wasn't
No, wait, that might actually it's interesting. I did another interview and we are talking about Cadillac. Like he was like, "Well, how did you write him?" I said, "Oh, well, I thought of every abusive man I've interacted with.
Yeah.
So yes, he is the personification of all of our
Okay, good. I thought so.
yeah. Yeah, that's him. And there's pieces. of him and things that he does that people who know me quite well are like, oh, I recognize that. And I'm like, yep. But I think, the devil is in all of us, but he was very much so in Cadillac. So
Yeah. I recognized my own experience of, like, loving and being very attracted to somebody who I could read the cues that I wasn't ethically aligned with them.
mhm,
Do you know, like,
yep.
the glory, the desire for fame and power and whatever, and just reading those cues and being like, "Well, I still see something that I want."
Yes,
And then being like, "I put myself in this position.
I
I
did it.
saw the cues, I
Yeah,
chose it anyway."
yeah,
And then
yeah.
having to, like, burn through that experience to get to the other side.
Very much so. It's very much like that you're putting yourself in that position. Like you're making this choice of free will. And then, you can't be surprised when you get burned at the end.
Mhm. But I
Yeah.
did love that she was aware that whole time. Like, she made those choices. She got the freedom she wanted.
Yeah.
She got the fucking canoe trip, you know? Like, she got she got to have the life.
Yeah. Yeah. She
Yeah.
did. And I think, Monique is the protagonist in this book, but she is not necessarily a protagonist all the time. I think both of them are antagonists. I think neither of them has a completely trustworthy narrative. One much less than the other.
Mm.
Let's be honest there. But I think probably everybody in New France at the time had to be quite wily, had to be quite smart, and it's keep yourself alive. And I think because of that, everyone is a little bit dangerous.
Can we go back to your your channeled work, to your thesis? I wanted to know what it was about.
Yeah, so UBC was a bit of a tumultuous time. I don't know if this story broke, oh gosh, maybe 2015. But when I was at UBC, my thesis advisor was Stephen Galloway, who later was, let me get these facts straight, suspended and then let go from the university. And he was accused of sexual assault and physical assault. And I don't remember the other accusations. And the case is working its way through the courts. It's a libel case now, so I have to be very careful about what I say. And he was my fiction thesis advisor, and my thesis is about 1980s Northern Ireland. It's not autofiction, but it's a mix of like fiction and nonfiction where it's real people, but it's a fictionalized story. I haven't looked at it since shelving it. And by shelving it, I mean finishing it. I have not returned to it. And I know that I have to because that's the kind of ghost that lingers over your shoulder.
Mm.
But the time at UBC was just so a bit wild that I haven't had the fortitude, I guess, to return to that work, even though it's kind of calling my name,
Mm.
like when like the heart under the floorboards, even when you wrap something up and put it away, it's still going to thump.
Mhm.
So that's definitely something in the future that I need
Mm.
to circle back to. And it's always in my brain.
Hmm. I wanna ask this question, it sounds really trite, but I don't mean it in a trite way, but, like, where do you think your stories are coming to you from? Or, like, why are you when you look at the stories you've written in the past and the stories that are calling out to you in the future,
Mhm.
like, what kinds of stories do you think are calling to you and why?
It's interesting. I've never felt the urge to write a story that's set now in the present,
Hmm.
which is interesting to me because I read a lot of stories that are set now in the present. But something about voices that perhaps have been forgotten or overwritten throughout history is very appealing to me. And, the next few books that I'm kind of turning over in my head are all in that vein. So I guess in a way that is kind of channeling because a voice from history kind of speaks out to you, peals like a bell, and then that worms its way into your brain and you can't get rid of it. So, yeah, I guess you could say, oh, it's the muse, but really it's just kind of an obsession where you hear one thing in passing and then you go, oh, I can't get that story out of my head. And then you're tethered to it.
What's your writing process like?
It is. I wish. So I only just learned this year about like, what do they call them? Plotters and pantsers, like people who sit down and plot out the book, plot out the timeline. That's not me. And I have major respect for people who do that. And then the pantsers, like the fly by the seat of the pants. And I just write like when the urge hits. And maybe it was a former professor at UBC who said, write where the heat is. And that was big for this book because the first scene I wrote is when Minique meets Cadillac at the banquet, because that's where the heat was. And then I kind of built it out around that. It's kind of like I put up the bones, like I put up the beams of the house, and then I go in and fill it all with drywall and insulation foam and stuff after the fact. So it's a bit all over the place, but it gets done. I don't think there is a right or wrong way to write. And I think that's what's so glorious about it. But I definitely go by the seat of my pants.
And do you have like if you feel the voice, the pealing of the bell, as you put it, and you're sitting down to write where the heat is, do you ritualize anything in any way? Like, do you have your witch sides?
I don't when it comes to writing. And that might actually be something to consider in the future. You think about it, you really are opening yourself up to stuff. And I never think about protecting myself in any regard. It's just kind of like falling in head first. I sleep very poorly when I'm writing, when I'm really deep in writing. That's a mix of things. That's like not being able to exercise or get physical because I'm spending my time writing. So I'm not just going to blame it on the writing, but your brain becomes so full that other aspects of your life start to become more colorless in response, I think. But that is a really, really good question. It's something I'm going to have to consider going forward, I think.
Yeah. It's nice to make some ritual space
Yes.
in life to interact with creativity. I like how Monique thinks about it, that I really related to that like, yeah, it's all in the mind, but what if? And
Yeah.
so for my own practice, like a bit of a communication with the plants out here, a little bit of, smoke,
Yeah.
a little bit of whatever, like those
Yeah.
things,
Yeah.
help me shift my brain somehow. I don't know if they help me sleep though.
Nothing helps me sleep. It's just, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, just straight exhaustion helps me sleep.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's interesting you said it feels like the rest of the life is sort of drained of color for a little while. It does sound a bit like a possession.
It really, when you're in it, and I think this is why I do writing residencies. It's
Mm.
easier to write when there's nothing else, where you just can be kind of a ghoul hunched over your computer or however you write. I have some friends who write by pen and paper, and that was why, going away to remote. I was like, you're going to Norway in the Arctic in winter? It was perfect. It was
Mhm.
great. There was nothing to do on the island really, except, sit and write and watch the snowstorms and the northern lights. So it is a possession. And I think it's really helpful when you remove yourself from other people if you have the means to. It's a great privilege to be able to pay to go somewhere. But even if you, lock yourself up in your apartment, you say, "Ooh, I can't deal with any of you." That's also
Mhm.
helpful as well.
Yeah. I read that piece you wrote about Lady Gaga and men draining your power.
Yes,
And I
that was
really
written when I was in Norway, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
I related to it hard, but as someone with like a 4-year-old and a partner, I was like, how do I carve
I
out the
know.
spaces?
You can't get rid of them. I know that was God, that piece came to me like a lightning bolt. And
Mhm.
I got some really interesting feedback on that. It was very split. But a lot of people, even, people who we're married or have partners or have children related with it. So I was like, okay, I'm tapping into something there. That's another thing. Like I've not really been dating because I've been busy writing 2 books. So it's kind of a trade-off. And that's one area of the life that kind of loses color when
Mm.
you're deep in writing, at least for me.
I mean, it sounds like it's a choice for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, very much so. It's like there's really only one font of creativity and what do I want to pour it into? So,
Right. Yeah. I just dropped my kid off at daycare. We just she just started daycare, so she's been home with us full time because the pandemic and stuff for 4
wow.
years, and
Yeah.
so she just started daycare last week.
Oh, that's a big step. How's she handling it?
Oh, she's good, thank you for asking, that's sweet of you. She's
Good.
alright, she's a bit sad on the way there and then excited when she's there.
Perfect.
Yeah, I feel like I have to walk around my house and, like, untangle my nervous system
Mhm.
from my
Mhm.
family for a little while,
Mhm.
and I think that's what, like, a witch's broom is sort of about too, like, I just have to clean
Yeah.
and untangle and and then I can, like, sense things in my own life and body again without it being all
Yeah.
sprayed out across the house, so I in that sense, I really related to what you wrote there.
Yeah, that's really apt. And like maybe that is one of my rituals for sitting down and writing. I have to write in like kind of a clean, organized space.
Mm.
Otherwise, whether that's mental, emotional, or physical, it's something because otherwise it's just all over the place.
Mhm. I feel that, yeah. I will open it to folks if you have any questions or responses.
I had one question just about your writing experience. You're talking about how the characters kind of came to you. I have another friend who's a writer, and we talk about this often. She says the characters kind of take the story where they're going.
Mhm.
Do you find that that's the case, or can you reel them in and kind of control the story where you want it to end up?
That's a really good question. And I think with this historical fiction, it's like there's so little about these
Mm,
people that's at least about Monique. And Cadillac's a difficult character too because he lied, we think, about everything. So there isn't really that much about him either. So I just kind of let them take, but okay, I really let him take me where he wanted to go. And that was somewhere pretty dark. But then she also went somewhere pretty dark. I think I'm thinking back, to other things I've written. I don't think I've ever been able to rein my characters in completely. I think that they very much, and that's because they're kind of part of me. Maybe they're my id, but they do what they want to do. They do the things that we aren't brave enough or, mad enough to do. And, bless my editors and agents who are like, yeah, great. Oh, yeah, that scene. Yeah, great. Perfect. There's been a lot of discussion on the internet lately about like, well, my agent tells me what to write. My editor tells me what to write, or, is that right or wrong? I think really when it comes down to it, it's the characters that tell you what to write. And it depends on how hard you're listening to them.
I know we have folks in our community who are doing graduate research in some cases about uncovering witch histories in different parts of the world, and then trying to figure out like, well, what do I do when the archives end? Like, what do I do when all I have is like 2 mentions and a birth date, and I go and sit in a graveyard and feel a lot of complicated things,
Mhm.
trying to figure out how to balance that in, I guess, in programs that aren't fiction is
Yeah.
different. But
Yeah.
do you have advice from a fiction perspective about how they can negotiate that?
That is, it's interesting. I keep saying, oh, that's so interesting because every question is so interesting. I
You're
just
obviously
read
one of us.
I shouldn't say I just read this, I think was last year. Okay, well, in my mind, A Ghost in the Throat. It's kind of a mix of fiction and nonfiction, and it's about a female poet. And I can't remember her name, and she wrote like the most well-known keen, like morning poem in Ireland. But there's so little known about this woman who was real, and the author, she's not a researcher. She is at the time like a stay-at-home mother, but she makes it a point to travel to different museums, travel to different, graveyards, places of residence to try to do research on this woman who's been lost. even despite writing one of, the country's most famous poems, she's been overwritten by history. So that's a really good book, I think, to start with. It's a beautiful read. I think fiction gives you a lot of liberties, and I was very lucky to be able to have the privilege of writing an author's note saying, I changed all the times. I changed, I changed this, I changed that. I didn't write about this event that happened. I didn't write about this. But it's still like, if you're kind of like a perfectionist like me, it's still very frustrating because you think, who was this person and are they actually real? And it makes you very angry because women or, you know, people who weren't white men have been like kind of erased from the record. So one of the research, rabbit holes I went down was I wanted to find a Wendat name from the time. And I thought, okay, how am I going to do this? I'll look at marriage licenses. I'll look at marriage licenses of white men who married indigenous women. Well, guess what? The indigenous women's names aren't put on any of those marriage licenses, which is like so dark. And that's one of the sort of angry making things of researching from a time period where white guys were controlling what was written down. So I guess my main advice is you try your best. You really just try your best. You do research. You try to put yourself in different people's shoes and you try your best. And maybe you say that in your author's note. Like, I tried my best here. And sometimes your best isn't good enough and people are going to hate it. And that's okay. As long as I think,
Yeah. I think trying your best is kind of the best advice for so many
Yeah.
of the things that we've tried to grapple with. You make me think of this other question I have, and it's not one that I expect you to have an answer for, but maybe we can think out loud about it together. But I think a lot about like the privilege involved in, even in doing what I do. I'm trying to do a podcast and write books about feminist history. And, I look back at my family history and like there was poverty there, but there's obviously white privilege there, stacks of systemic privilege,
Mhm.
From the perspective of my grandparents, they were very poor, but they didn't have the perspective to look around at all of the stacks they had climbed on,
Yeah.
all that violence. And so I try to think about like, well, how does a person who has been traditionally marginalized, underprivileged, violated, how does that person get the time to travel around to all the places that
Mhm.
their characters were maybe left a mark in the different museums? How do they get the time to like write all day and go,
Yeah.
it's hard. I can't do it. How do we do that work to write those better stories and write those imbalances to write those better stories?
Oh, it's a difficult question. And, I should also say, like, I'm grateful to Canada's arts granting programs because I wouldn't be able to do a lot of my research without the first book was Ontario Arts Council and the second book was Canada Council. So thank you, Canada Council, for the arts. Shout out to you. But it is true. Like, even writing a grant application takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And, you know, I I'm privileged in that, like, I just work one job. I work full time. It's just one job. So I have hours off to do stuff. I think Canada is oh, making strides to sort of right some wrongs, but I don't know. It's hard to tell because the pendulum swings in so many different directions. And I think the groundswell of alt-right sentiment we're seeing is really worrying me. I don't know. It is a difficult question and it's hard to see the future, but it is something that I definitely keep in mind. Writing both books, writing the first book, we were guests on the Moose Cree First Nation land. Like, it was very much like I am a white person writing about something that I don't know a lot about. And with this book, it was a really difficult decision what to do about, the settlers were living alongside the Haudenosaunee. Like, they were in a period of truce, but it was, cheek to jowl living in a way. And for me, I wanted to include, indigenous people at the time, but I didn't want to include too many because then I'd start telling a story that wasn't mine. So striking that balance, who knows if I did it correctly? Probably not. but it is something that's in my mind all the time, you know?
Yeah, totally. I noticed that sort of tension there. Like you want to meet those people and hear their
Hmm.
voices, but you're not the right person to give us those voices. And so you
Yeah.
can feel that I thought it was gracefully done.
Thank you.
It's tricky though, man. It's probably not. I,
It's
I wouldn't say
tricky.
it's perfectly done because I don't think there is a perfect, but
I don't think there
yeah.
is either. And I was talking with one of my blurbers about this, and he was like, I think you did, you did it the way you wanted to do it. And I just thought, well, I think Monique would have just been kind of horny. Like I think I think she just would have been so flabbergasted by seeing like clean male flesh that maybe that this is how we should frame this interaction.
Yeah, she's
And
just a person. She's just a
she's
person who's
just a
been wrapped up her
person.
whole life, who feels
She's just a
feelings.
person. And she's finally meeting men who like wash themselves and like look nice. So that was the tack I took. Who knows if it was the right tack, but that was
Right.
the choice I made.
Right, because like objectifying, sexualizing the one time these people come into
Yeah,
the story is like pretty complicated.
it
Like,
is.
yeah,
Yeah.
I thought about that too. But
Yeah.
it did seem like it was kind of like respectfully done, and the people seemed like real people, and it seemed like pretty accurate to who Monique was.
Yeah, I think I think with the build up in that story, you're like, "Oh, yeah, of course, that would be her reaction."
Oh, I did have one more question. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about Dirty Work?
Yeah, I would love to. I love that book. So it was our memoir, which, I hate saying because it's like, okay, you were like 28. What did you write a memoir about? But I worked up north in Northern Ontario at a fly-in fishing lodge. It was just south of the tip of James Bay. So not quite in polar bear territory. Thank God. I had fished there as a guest the summer before and fallen in love with it and then applied to work as a housekeeper. And it was about my summer in what I think is the most beautiful place on earth, to be honest, or one of the most beautiful places on earth. And sort of the difficulty of adapting to, and I'm putting this in air quotes, the wilderness, which is to me a little bit of a colonial term. It's a place I'm not used to, and what it was like to interact with like bears face to face and be in close quarters with all these young people and kind of this soup of hormones during like a crazy summer. So it's so interesting. I still love that book to bits. With Monique, I just kind of feel almost ambivalent about it now. I don't know if that's the difference between memoir and fiction, but
Hmm.
yeah. So that's Dirty Work. And it still makes me laugh when I read parts of it. I don't know if an author should admit that.
Do you think you'll write memoir again?
Probably not. I don't think
Mm.
so. I don't really know what else there is in my life. Okay, I do. There's like at least one thing I could write about, but I never would. So I don't think I'd do it. I'm so glad that was my, introduction into the publishing world. It felt very exciting and very fun. So I feel
Hmm.
very grateful for that.
Yeah, it's funny to think like maybe we all, my co-author Amy, we met playing music together and she told me like everybody has one solo album in them. Like everyone should make
Mm,
a solo album. Everybody has a set of their own songs.
yep.
And I've heard other people say like everybody could write their first book because everyone's life is totally unique. And like we all want to read everyone's first book because it's like show me inside your brain and your soul and your body. But like not everybody has a second book. Maybe,
Yep.
like you're a writer if you're going to tackle beyond that first personal
Yeah.
story.
Very much so. I like that a lot. So I got my solo album out. It was my first one. And, what a way to enter the publishing world.
And now it's stories and hits and channeling. Nothing but the hits.
I bet the hair.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and for doing the research in and doing the channeling and doing the digging into the peeling bells inside yourself to give us this very kindred witch.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I love talking about it.
Yeah, thanks. We love getting to meet her and getting to meet you through her. So thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
And blessed fucking be.
you must be a witch.
The Missing Witches podcast is created by Risa Dickens and Amy Torok, with insight and support from the Coven at patreon.com/missingwitches. Amy and Risa are the co-authors of Missing Witches, Reclaiming True Histories of Feminist Magic, which is available now wherever you get your books or audiobooks, and of New Moon Magic, 13 anti-capitalist tools for resistance and re-enchantment, coming fall 2023.